Good evening from Kiev. That is the special broadcast of the Sunday show. This time we have usually we do the summary of the week, but this time we are doing the summary of the 4 years, at least, of the reforms in Ukraine. We have Francis Malige, who is the Managing Director of the European EBRD in Eastern Europe and Caucasus. He now moving to a different position and will become the Managing Director of the EBRD for financial institutions. But Francis was in Ukraine for a very exciting and complicated period, and our discussion would be also about what we lived through. Is really the Ukrainian business climate had changed? Are the investors coming? How really the reforms are moving? And is it the case when the Western partners are driving reforms, or what's the role of the Ukrainian institutions? But there are a lot of issues. And Francis, probably the first would be very general. Has the business climate in Ukraine changed after the revolution? Is it considerably different, or it just a bit better, or more or less the same? As we know that there are not that many still like high-profile investors here.
It's a very good question. Good evening. I think there's been very, very large improvements in the business climate in Ukraine, but there's also very large room for improvement, meaning things that still need to improve. I think one of the things we see, first of all, you build a business climate for investors. If it's good for Ukrainian investors, it's also going to be good for foreign investors. I don't believe you build a special business climate for foreign investors to attract them. I don't think that's the way an economy works. The other thing that you have when you meet foreign investors outside of Ukraine, very often in many countries, they know someone who has had an issue in the past in Ukraine. And so that makes it difficult to convince people to come into the country, because they tend to listen to their compatriots more than they will listen to us, of course. Now, what I also see is that those that are here, they see growth in their numbers, they see profitability in many cases, they want to invest more money. And you know, when you look at the way the business has evolved, when I came 4 years ago, the number one issue that existed and that everybody was complaining about was about VAT reimbursements. It was impossible to get your VAT back from the state if you are an exporter. And for an exporter, it's really a problem, because structurally, you actually pay more VAT to the state, and you are entitled to get VAT back on your exports, but you need the money back from the state. And that has completely disappeared, because the corruption that was involved in the VAT reimbursements has disappeared. The state has put together an electronic system for VAT repayments. So that source of corruption and that source of worry for investors is completely gone. Now, what remains today is an environment where there's still questions around the rule of law, questions around the property rights. If I come to Ukraine, say the investors, and if I invest dozens of millions of euros into a new plant, am I actually sure that it will be mine, or will someone through corrupt court decisions try to take it away from me? And that uncertainty remains. I think there's a very, very big positive evolution with the creation of the Anti-Corruption Court, with the new Supreme Court recently took a decision in favor of for an investor who was being defrauded by another party. So those are very good signs. For now, they're right at the top of the court system. And so this change needs to go down into the lower level courts. And we also need to see some change in the way the Secret Service and the Prosecutor's Office behave, in order for there to be an environment that will be truly attractive to foreign investors.
On what it depends? Is it about the political will?
Mostly.
Or how would you define this political will? What could be done? Like really, because some of the things, if you speak long term, you think like there is a long path of the reform, there should be structural reforms. But we are almost up to 5 years after revolution, and which means that there was already time to think about there was already time to make a plan. So if to make a priorities, those things you mentioned, for instance, about the possible involvement of the law enforcement into the business, which could be concern.
You need to reduce the opportunities for corruption. And on that account, Ukraine has done tremendous progress through a number of reforms in the gas sector, in the banking sector, with this VAT, with the Prozoro system for procurement and so on. The opportunity to steal is much smaller, still exists, but it's much smaller than it was 4 years ago. But you also need to do two other things on which, honestly, less progress has been made. You need to hold people to account. Okay? In the case that I was mentioning with this investor that was being defrauded, they lost in court in the first instance. They lost in court in the appeals. Then they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court completely destroyed the first two judgments and sent it back to the lower courts. But that's not enough. What happened to the judges? Are they still judging these judges, or are they being investigated? Is a question. And the third thing that needs to happen as well, and where Ukraine has not made a lot of progress, is getting the money back. So I think what needs to happen is, and it's hard to do these two things, because you can't hold a judge to account without thinking through how you're going to do this and still preserve the independence of the judiciary. You don't want to have a system where the judges are under the influence of the executive. So these are difficult things to do, but it does take very strong leadership, very strong political will, a consensus among parliament and among the government to drive these changes.
Ukraine is coming to the election cycle in 2019, both presidential and parliament elections. And what are also your concerns, and in particularly in the negotiations and agreements with international partners? We already have the example that, for instance, on the gas prices, there were negotiations with IMF that the prices would be higher, and then there was increase, but later was explained like, no, we won't move more than like 23% instead of 63% raise. So what are you concerned that because of the political campaigning, a lot of these kind of agreements which were reached and promises won't be either performed or they just would be dropped?
Well, politics is politics. So to win elections, sometimes you need to make decisions that economists don't agree with. All right, but that's not my concern. We're an investor. We see good projects and we invest in good projects. I'd like to see more good projects. And in order to do that, you need to bring some visibility. Okay? Now, people say, there's an election and it's not clear who's going to win. And to me, sorry, but that's democracy. It's actually a good thing when you cannot know who's going to be the next MP and the next president. It means it's a competitive election, and not everyone in every country in the world has that. That's called democracy, right? But in order for there to be a situation where a change in government does not completely change the business climate, the reform environment, and so on and so forth, what you need is strong institutions. Okay? Before the presidential election, before the parliamentary election, Ukraine has a strong central bank. After, it will still have a strong central bank. And the independence and the strength of that institution need to be preserved and need to be respected so that in Ukraine there is no uncertainty as to what's happening to the banking sector depending on who's the president. That's not how advanced countries work. You have strong institutions that respect the political power and are respected by the political power.
But for instance, in cases of particular policies or like the land reform, which everybody said that it wouldn't ever happen before the end of the election cycle, but it's lasting for decades already.
First, I think you don't have private property if you cannot sell. Okay? So having a land reform that enables people that want to sell their land to sell it is a matter of democracy, freedom, human rights, and so on. It's okay if you own an apartment in a city and suddenly people say you cannot sell it. then why did you save your money and put it in your apartment? You don't have the money anymore. Okay, so the right to sell is important. If you have the right to sell, then other people have to have the right to buy, by definition. Otherwise, there's no market. Now, this is a very difficult question that has a lot of stakeholders that are interested. The landowners, the small farmers, the large companies, foreigners that may want to invest, and so on. And so it's very, very complicated. I think a lot of progress has actually been made in developing a vision for a land market once it's opened. Okay, there has to be the rules of the market. There has to be financing available for the market. If you open the land market and then you do not make financing available, then people that don't have much money and want to buy the land that they're working, especially the small farmers, won't be able to continue working that land, and that's bad. And then you also need, and that's where the rule of law environment is really important. You also need a dispute resolution mechanism. If after the opening of the market, suddenly your neighbor comes and says, hey, that piece of land there is mine, you need to have a mechanism that you can trust, where a decision is going to be made whether the boundary between his land and your land is actually here or there or should be decided differently. And so it's not something that you can do quickly. It is something that will have to happen, again, because there's no private property if there's no right to sell, but also because on the basis of the current system of leases, there's no encouragement for people to invest in the land. And irrigation, for example, is very insufficient, especially in the south of the country, to get any better with the climate change and with the global warming and so on and so forth. So the ability to invest in irrigation in land is going to be critical for the future success of the already successful agriculture in Ukraine. And the problem is, no one's going to make a decision to invest more than the value of the land in irrigation systems if you're not sure that you can keep it. If you have a 5-year lease and the land cost is $1,000, why are you going to invest $2,000 worth of equipment and irrigation that you cannot move to the next piece of land if you need to move?
One of the direction EBRD was and is following is the privatization of the big state-owned companies. And there was no any really big case, a really successful case, a showcase for the international partners. We can speak about the Odessa portside factory. So what is your take on that? If we summarize of what had happened within the last 4 years, I remember all the time we talked to the ministers, what is the priority? And they would give this list of 20 companies, and in the end it never really happened.
Yes. Well, it's true that there's not been privatizations. What is actually not completely true is that there's been no progress. I think there has been progress. We now have a modern privatization law that is much better than what existed before. We now have the means to have transparent auctions for privatizations. However, it's not easy to privatize the state-owned firms in Ukraine because most of them are actually difficult cases that anyone would find it hard to attract good and transparent investors in some of these cases because of some corruption schemes that exist in those companies, because of some very high debt situations that exist in some of these companies. Some of them have very little activity, so you buy yourself a plant, but it doesn't work, you need to restart it. In the case of the energy sector companies, some of them have their own legal issues. Coal is not very attractive to investors anymore. So, for example, Center Energo, which is a good company, profitable company and so on, but works on coal. 4 years ago, it would have been more attractive, but a lot of large energy companies have actually moved away from the coal. So it's going to be difficult to attract good investors. But there's no reason that for this program to not move forward. We now have, again, a good privatization law.
What makes this law better? Why you trust in that?
For example, one of the things that was fixed in this law was under the previous law, you needed to have a valuation of the assets done under Ukrainian valuation standards, and that often are not the standards that are used by international investors, and often resulted in inflated price expectations. And so if you start an auction with too high a price, a lot of investors are going to come and say, it's not even worth looking at this, because if you set a minimum price at this much and the value that I see is here, why would I bother?
So what are the maybe top priority enterprises you think are now on, could be privatized, where we should look at, where are investors looking?
Well, there's a list that the government has drawn up. It's a good list. There's 3,000 state-owned enterprises to choose from in Ukraine. What really matters is to actually get going with hiring advisors and professional advisors and moving forward with a few cases to demonstrate that it can be done.
And what hinders this process at this stage?
You do have one is that the people that make decisions in the various agencies and the government are not really incentivized to make decisions. As a bureaucrat, and that's not specifically Ukrainian, in the world, as long as you have not made a decision, you have not made a mistake. If you have, and that's more specifically Ukrainian, the risk that if you decide a price that's lower, or if you sell something and then someone says, no, the price was too low, you are criminally liable, and that is that of course creates a barrier for people to make decisions. You have people using the court system to slow down the process, very effectively, I must say, unfortunately.
Prime Minister Groysman had signed the new strategy of cooperation with EBRD. So what will change?
I'm not aware that he signed anything, but we met him this week to introduce my successor. We signed a loan with a local agri-business company that produces sugar to create a biogas plant on the basis of the residue of sugar production. We are also very keen to work on the integration of Ukraine with the nearby countries, because integration is not just about signing an agreement with the EU or with someone else. It's also having the physical, logistical means to implement it. Better roads, better railways, ports that are well operated, and so on.
When you mention neighbors, Ukrainians would be concerned. You mean like our Western neighbors, Northern neighbors, Eastern neighbors?
Well, I think good ports are good for every neighbor, okay? Including the neighbors that are on the other side of the planet, actually, because once the grain is on the ship, it could be going to China, okay? So when we look at the infrastructure network of Ukraine, we discuss priorities with the government. And then when we look at roads, railroads, airports, ports, improving the airports in Ukraine could be and should be done. There should be more competition. There should be about comparing the Lviv and the Dnipro airports, which is quite striking because the Lviv airport has many more flights, is not operated as a monopoly, and therefore it's actually much cheaper to go from to Lviv than to Dnipro. So that if anybody wants to study the influence of competition on growing a market, just look at Lviv and Dnipro airports. You have your PhD thesis just right there in front of you. Now you say, should the road go to the east or go to the west? That's for the country to choose. I invest in roads so that they are happy roads, that they are good quality roads with fewer potholes, with contracts with people that manage these roads that are actually based on the quality of the road rather than on the quantity of asphalt that they pour onto the road. It's much easier to count the holes than to make sure that the proper kilograms or tons of asphalt are put on the road. This being said, I've been earlier this year to a city like Mariupol, and I think Ukraine should invest more in the connectivity to that city. Especially as we all read in the press that the The connectivity through the port is reduced these days due to the bridge being built and so on. So I don't want to go into the geopolitics of it, but I do think that there's a need to reinforce the linkage between Mariupol and the rest of the country.
And, do you have the feeling that, and sometimes it's said that sometimes it looks like the Western partners are pushing more reforms than the people who, let's say, the government and the politicians?
Okay. I think what we do, we're never successful when we're the only ones pushing reforms. I don't believe that the Western partners reform Ukraine. I think Ukrainians reform Ukraine. And I think they reform Ukraine for Ukrainians. They don't reform Ukraine because it's going to make them look good in the eyes of the EBRD. They don't care, and they should not care. They should care about their country, and that's what they do.
But do you feel the will is there? And is it enough of that will?
There can always be more. But yes, I feel the will is there.
There was the case when Ukraine issued bonds a year ago, yeah? And then you mentioned that it kind of a loose hope that Ukraine can live without IMF tranche, and now they are again talking about go to the market and discuss the new program. So do you think it's an opportunity to kind of avoid reforms? Like get the money instead of having the money which are conditional?
Well, first of all, I think there's conditions to the new IMF program anyway. Okay? And there's conditions to the European Union macrofinancial assistance, there's conditions to the World Bank loans, and when we work in the public sector, there's also conditions to our own enterprises or of projects in the public sphere. We also have conditions, by the way, in our loans to the private sector, but they tend to be less public conditions, they tend to be about how to transform the inside. Now, yes, there's no strict conditionality attached to a Eurobond, other than the expectation of the Eurobond investors that the cooperation will continue. When you talk to investors, and if you ask the question of the Ministry of Finance or of other people, they will tell you one of the first questions that every investor has is, where are you in your IMF program?
So generally, what is your take on the whole idea to issue Eurobonds for Ukraine?
Every country, probably with some exceptions, those that are very resource rich, but continuously needs to borrow money. Here we have a situation where there's a lot of focus on one particular, because the market was not very open for Ukrainian issuances in the past few months, on the basis that people did not know whether there was going to be or not a continuation of the cooperation with the fund. Now you have that cooperation that continues, that reduces the uncertainty that I was talking about, so it makes it possible for Ukraine to borrow money. We'll see at what price, okay? But it's not a good or a bad idea, it's just proper finance management for the government.
And about absolute numbers, so is EBRD planning to have more projects in Ukraine, provide more funds, or it would be more or less the same for the next year?
In the past few years, we've had years where we've invested as little as 600 million a year in Ukraine, some years where we've invested more than $1 billion. Always I'd like to be around $1 billion rather than around 600 million. But the truth is, we don't really have an envelope for Ukraine. We are constantly looking for good projects in the private sector and also in state companies that want to transform themselves.
What are the relations between EBRD and Naftogaz? There was a case when the Naftogaz was receiving the loans for the program for buying the gas. That program, as far as I know, was stopped. What is the future of that, and what are the discussions?
Well, the program you're mentioning, it was not stopped in the sense that someone decided to stop it. It was a 3-year loan. After 3 years, Naftogaz paid back. That's what normally happens when the loan goes well, is that the client pays back. Okay. We do have loans outstanding with Naftogaz. We actually have a program underway, co-financed with the EIB, to refurbish in some sections of the pipeline, the main Orangoi-Pomare-Uzhgorod pipeline. That is live. We're talking about improving production with UGV. That's one of the conversations that's ongoing. And we've actually had conversations around a new form of financing for gas purchases, which for now have not been conclusive, but we remain available and interested.
And also, there was the statement by Naftogaz that in case there won't be rise of the price and there won't be equal for the business and the private people, that they would have losses like 45 billions of Ukrainian hryvnias next year. Mm-hmm. Do you share those concerns?
I think what you need to see in Ukraine is a real gas market, and then there's a regulation of the gas market, which is decided by the regulator in terms of what price and to whom. But what I see is too much people taking gas and not paying for it. That shouldn't happen. What I see is too many people doing what is politely called price arbitration, and which you can translate as into cheating. Because it consists in pretending that you've delivered gas to individuals at the individual price and then you pocket it from the government, and in fact selling it at corporates at a higher price. So there's consequences in a country like Ukraine to having two different prices, one for the people and one for the companies. And that consequence is more corruption and a less well-functioning market. And that's not to say that it's not hard for people who have to pay more money for their gas and for their heating. But what we say is the answer to these people's issues is not a lower price, it is a subsidy that is targeted on the people that actually do not have the means to pay for the gas. Because if you have a lower price for individuals, what you're doing is you're in fact subsidizing the richer people. They have larger houses, they tend to have them warmer in the winter, and so if you give a lower price to everyone, you're giving essentially a subsidy to the richer people, and that is taken from the poorer people.
And what are also the latest developments around the Ukranero?
Mm-hmm.
In particularly regarding the supervisory boards?
I think a supervisory board was appointed, and Ukrenergo must continue towards its corporatization, towards its what's called unbundling, which is a bit of a barbaric word, but means essentially separating the transmission grid from the supervision of the Ministry of Energy. There's in an electricity market, just like in a gas market, there's a core set of wires or pipelines in the case of the gas that makes no sense to replicate, makes no sense to open to competition. It is the main backbone of the distribution network in the country. That is a natural monopoly. As a natural monopoly, it needs to be regulated properly.
But do you have any concerns regarding this particular company?
We're following the situation, but I'm not particularly concerned.
You are in the supervisory board of the Privatbank. Are you going to stay? And what is the perspective of Privatbank to be privatized?
Well, I think my term runs out at the next assembly, next shareholders meeting. That's in April or May. Okay. I suppose that's a conversation that we will have to have. I came onto the supervisory board of Privat at the request of the Ukrainian authorities and with the agreement of the top management of EBRD. And I think this supervisory board works well. We have a bank that now is on the path to recovery. We have a new CEO that's leading the charge. So I'm staying. And I think the bank has to be privatized. But in order to privatize it, it needs to demonstrate that it develops a new business model the old business model of taking deposits out of the people's pockets and lending it to people that don't pay back, that's not a good business model for a bank. So it needs to develop a business model of lending money to people that actually pay back. And that's not the old clients. So that, in order to demonstrate that, it will take a little bit of time. And so I expect that the bank will be ready to privatize probably somewhere in 2021. Okay, at that point, it would be a great positive impact on the banking sector of Ukraine to see such a large bank go back into the private sector. I'm sure you know that by now the state-owned banks represent more than half of the banking sector in Ukraine. So it's Privat, Oshad, Exim, and Ukrgaz, that's too much. That's too much and should be reduced.
We're coming to the end of our conversation. There was a case. You publicly supported the former Minister of Finance, Alexander Daniluk, when he was attacked. So, how would you explain by whom, why he was attacked, and in the end, why he had to leave?
Well, I'm not the police, so I don't know who was attacking him. I just pointed out an inconsistency, which when I saw that a photograph that had been taken in my own house, in my own apartment in Paris, was portrayed as being something that was his, and in London, I just said, that's not true. I know this photograph, I know this place, it's my place. So there was a lot of noise around it. So much the better. I think everyone who wants to print news should check their sources and frame their sentences in the proper way. So why did he have to leave? I think it's a question to ask him.
But still, how do you feel? It's not just about Daniluk, but as well, within the period of your time, Natalie Reska, who went to Puerto Rico, and then there was also Ivar Sabrimevicius. All people were considered these young reformers. In the end, they left. They've done a lot, in particular to the cooperation of the partners like you. So, is there any disappointment about those kind of things? That these kind of people...
Why someone leaves a job like a minister is a very complex decision. I think these are very difficult jobs with a lot of pressure, with a lot of things to do. Every single one of them, I'm sure, had their own reasons to leave. I regret a lot of them because they were great partners and courageous and making the right decisions for the country. We're constantly looking for people inside the government, but also in the private sector, who are willing to go the extra mile to work on making the country better.
What is your message? What are your messages? Probably they are different to your successor, and also to the Ukrainians. You kind of spend time and work together.
Well, to my successor, I said that it's going to be a lot of fun. That it's probably not going to be a boring job, but that it's really worth it, because you see the impact of what EBRD does on the ground on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really happy with the engagement that we have in many spheres in the economy and the support that we're giving to the reformers. To the Ukrainian people, if I may, I'd like to say, don't lose hope. Keep going, and because you're doing the right thing, you're taking your country to new places, and also it's probably time to build, to think about building better institutions even more. There's too many situations in Ukraine that I see are being resolved by heroes. People that make the right decision, that go to try to influence powerful people in the right way, and these are the people that have led the Maidan, and so it's time for the time of heroes to give way to the time of institutions.
Yeah.